Hello, and welcome to another episode of Kings of History, a podcast where we will talk about all the kings of Portugal in chronological order. In the last episode, we saw King Afonso Henriques sort out his marital situation and his relationship with his cousin, King Alfonso VII. Then he turned his attention to conquering what now were Muslim territories. Today, we will learn in great detail the circumstances of the attack on Lisbon. We'll also see the departure of a great Christian name from Iberian lands, but also the birth of another. And we will finally learn about the tragic story that became known as the Tragedy of Badajoz. Before we proceed, we would like to remind you all that you can listen to every single episode released so far on our website, kingsofhistory.buzzsprout.com, as well as on the most common podcasting platforms. You can also follow us on social media so that you are always updated regarding new releases and other fun things as well. Drop a follow and a like, it helps a lot. Let's resume our story, shall we? With Santarém taken, Lisbon was now vulnerable. Afonso Henriques learned, possibly through his marital connection, or from Bernard of Clairvaux, that a fleet was approaching from the North Sea, heading to the Second Crusade. There were around 13,000 soldiers on 164 ships from England, Normandy, Flanders, Boulogne, and various Germanic territories, who sailed through the north of the Iberian Peninsula, rounding Galicia, and ending their nautical voyage by docking in Porto on the 16th of June, 1147, where they were received by Pedro Pitões, Bishop of Porto, who gave a passionate speech in an attempt to convince them to take part in the Reconquista. Initially, the Crusaders weren't too keen on taking part, but after the arrival of João Peculiar, Archbishop of Braga, the man from the north decided to join forces with the King of the Portuguese. According to one of the most faithful accounts by Raul Osberto, on the 17th of June, the Crusader Armada left the Douro Bar with João Peculiar. On the 28th of June, the armed forces entered the Tagus River, where, during docking, the first clashes took place, with the city's forces protecting the populated suburbs. The following day, on the 29th of June, the Crusader leaders had their first meeting with King Afonso Henriques, who had already been in the vicinity with his troops for a few days. King Afonso Henriques immediately began to lay out on the table the requirements for this collaboration, taking advantage of his negotiation skills and the awe that his physique instilled. Afonso Henriques took the position that the constant wars with the Muslims in the region meant that there was no great treasure awaiting them, so the only thing he could promise was the sacking of the city that he believed to be very rich. The different parties of Crusaders quickly fractured. The Flemish and the Germanics readily accepted the agreement proposed by Afonso Henriques, but the English and the Normans, disgruntled, threatened not to continue with the campaign and head for Palestine. However, a man by the name of Hervey Glanville managed to persuade the Anglo-Normans to continue with the siege, with the promise that they would keep the best part of the loot and profit from the hostages, while Afonso Henriques and the Portuguese would keep what was left. This agreement also guaranteed that the king would distribute the properties of the city and the surrounding area under the Frankish custom, thus benefiting all those who wanted to remain in those lands after the conquest. This would birth the Vila Francas we know of today. Lisbon was a fairly large city at the time, with between 120 and 154,000 inhabitants according to an Arabic account at the time. But, as usual, we need to be wary of these numbers. Its topology was a corridor between the Castle Hill and the river, with two suburbs of some importance, Alfama to the east and Alcamim to the west. The great importance of the city is due to its vast territorial and productive control, as well as its natural harbor, which was the largest in all of current-day Portugal. By controlling Lisbon, the Muslims would be denied control of the region and their naval base, from where they launched most of their attacks, both by land and by sea, therefore being neutralized. This city also had the great advantage of being able to be more appropriately used on foreign trade than Coimbra. Before any moves were made on either side, João Peculiar also tried to sign a Muslim surrender agreement, using history to indicate that those lands had, in the recent past, belonged to the Europeans who were there, and that they had been taken away under treachery during the Visigothic civil wars. But this agreement did not materialize. The positions of the three attacking fronts were then established: the English and the Normans occupying the western area, the Germanics and Flemish to the east, and King Afonso Henriques with his troops between the two, thus beginning the attacks on the city. The siege of the city used several machines provided by an Italian expert, such as battering rams to use against doors, catapults, and assault towers that each Crusader group would have, with the Germanics and Flemish being the most adept at siege technology, having even developed tactics to mine the walls from the underground. Between advances and retreats, the siege lasted several weeks, with the city walls even collapsing over Germanic mines. And on the 19th of October, 1147, the construction of the English wooden tower on the western side was completed. 2 days later, on the 21st of October 1147, it reached the walls, and the Muslims promptly asked for a halt to the fighting by handing over 5 hostages as a gesture of goodwill so that negotiations could begin on the terms of surrender. We now interrupt our story to mention an episode that was literally caught between the gates of myth and reality. After all, what is a country without its heroes? We've already seen how a son defeated his mother, and how that same son, who was the good cousin of a certain emperor of all Hispania, got his footing and managed to be recognized as king. Any great epic has to have its martyrs. Achilles died in Troy. Julius Caesar died on the Ides of March. And, not to be outdone, our own Martim Muniz voluntarily died wedged between the gates of Lisbon to prevent them from closing and guarantee the Portuguese access to the Muslim-occupied city. However, reality sometimes disappoints. In all likelihood, this story is nothing more than a legend. Firstly, because the conquest of that great city was not due to any single decisive moment. Rather, it was a combination of events that forced the attackers to first dominate the surroundings around the square, then to try to break down the wall, and, once that was done, to put an end to the resistance within the walls. And it was expected that, if the defenders didn't surrender, there would be a fierce battle for the alcove. Today is St. George's Castle. All these events, which took place between the 1st of July and the capitulation of the Muslims on the 20th of October, are described by the various witnesses, mainly Crusaders, to the siege and in the chronicles. Martim Muniz's episode, on the other hand, isn't mentioned at all, and you'd expect it to be, given the degree of heroism and the sheer epic proportions. It's much more likely that the descendants of this character, who were important to Portugal's first king in other ways, conjured this tale in order to bring even more glory to their family. The fact is that, after the siege of Lisbon, there are no more references proving that Martim Muniz survived 1147. He may well have died during the siege of the current Portuguese capital, although the only door he could have been trapped in was probably the one that separates the realm of the living from that of the dead. It was King Afonso Henriques who negotiated the terms of surrender. His terms were quite generous, even though they couldn't keep their movable assets and, in some cases, valuable real estate. The inhabitants of the city could choose to stay or leave safely. However, these terms did not please the Crusaders at all. In the midst of disagreements, the Crusaders mutinied and invaded the city, sacking it and claiming several victims. And there were even fears of a Crusader attack on King Afonso Henriques' camp. In order to guarantee a fair distribution of the city's wealth, King Afonso Henriques allowed a group of 140 English and Norman men and another group of 160 Germanic and Flemish men to enter the city with him on the 25th of October 1147. However, the Germanic side began to plunder indiscriminately, and Afonso Henriques had to be imperative in order to restore order, even threatening to abandon the siege. So the Crusaders, in order not to lose their share of the loot and possibly even the city, submitted to the Portuguese king's order. King Afonso Henriques also allowed the Crusaders who wanted to carry on their way to take their booty free of any tax when they left the kingdom, and those who wanted to stay could establish colonies where they could live under their own laws and customs. These colonies became known as the Vilas Francas, the best known of which is Vila Franca de Xira. This settlement of Crusaders greatly eased the effort to settle the surrounding territories. In the aftermath, with Lisbon and the surrounding area conquered, the castle of Sintra promptly surrendered, the castle of Palmela was abandoned, and the castle of Almada submitted, leaving all the territory between Leiria and Lisbon under Portuguese control, including the fortified square of Óbidos, which also submitted. After this major loss on the Muslim side, the next focus of their attacks would have to be the territories between the Mondego River and the Sado River. It was also after the conquest of Lisbon that the Portuguese developed the fishing area of Peniche and the harbor of Nazaré. After the conquest of Lisbon, Portugal had 6 diocesan capitals: Braga, Porto, Coimbra, Viseu, Lamego, and Lisbon, and only 3 bishops, even though the Bishop of Coimbra was under the authority of Santiago de Compostela. Coimbra was the seat of power of the King of Portugal. The same was true with the other dioceses south of the Douro River, that should have been subjects to the bishops of Santiago de Compostela, were under the political control of Afonso Henriques and João Peculiar. Still, in 1147, King Afonso Henriques restored the Diocese of Lisbon and chose the Englishman Gilbert of Hastings as its first bishop. But who consecrated this new bishop, and who would consecrate new bishops in the future? Of course, it would be João Peculiar. The time when Diego Gelmírez, Archbishop of Santiago de Compostela, controlled the political and religious fates of the Iberian Peninsula had come to an end. As such, Diego Gelmírez and Afonso VII protested in front of the Pope, but with little to no effect. In 1148, the first Portuguese princess and second daughter of Afonso Henriques and Matilda was born, named Urraca. A year later, in 1149, the European kingdoms would admit the total failure that was the Second Crusade. It could be said that the only positive outcome of this crusade was the conquest of Lisbon by the Portuguese. During these last few years, the Iberian Peninsula began to see ways for its monarchs to take a more active stance in the conquest of Almoravid lands, given that the empire was becoming increasingly weakened and fragmented due to the successive independence of various parts, also out of fear of the new emerging faction, the Almohads. In Aragon, Ramiro II spread his territory to the border of the county of Barcelona, which was commanded by Ramon Berenguer IV, who in 1148 took Tortosa, reaching the banks of the Ebro River, and by 1150 the entire river valley belonged to the Europeans. Around this time, Afonso VII expanded as far as Almeria, conquering Oreja, Uria, and Calatrava, but failed to take the great city of Cordoba, which was frustrating for him and his plans to expand westwards. In 1151, the third descendant of King Afonso Henriques was born, a princess named Teresa, and in the same year, Ibn Qazi, the political leader who controlled the region of Silves, was violently punished by the population and ended up dying after he tried to propose an alliance and submission to King Afonso Henriques to try and protect himself from the very real and growing threat of the Almohads. we can find a statue of Ibn Qazi today in Mertola. During these years and after the conquest of Lisbon, King Afonso Henriques didn't exactly rest on his laurels. Between reorganizing the territory in depth and stopping other Muslim attacks commanded by Ibn Wazir on the southern borders of his territory, all of this took up a lot of his time. In order to populate the marshy area to the south of Leiria, King Afonso Henriques allowed the Cistercian monks to settle in Alcobaça in 1152, an extremely important donation since it became a very important institution in medieval Portugal. These Cistercian monks from the Cistercian order, created by the monk Robert of Molane, who abandoned the very important Abbey of Cluny due to the political machinations and the economic power hoarded by these black monks, who Robert saw as not fitting to the simple and humble lifestyle imposed by the teachings of the Church. In sum, the Cluniac monks gave up the working part of their vows and made the peasants and communities who depended on them servants of their abbeys, which were also not submitted to any episcopal authority. The Cistercian order rediscovered the joy of manual labor and started to develop new trades. The Cistercian order's metallurgical, agricultural, and other techniques were among the best at the time, meaning that these monks were able to transform uncultivated land into excellent production areas, such as the marshes south of Leiria. One of the sponsors of this new abbey was Bernard of Clairvaux. During these years, despite having his hands full with the reorganization of the territory, King Afonso Henriques saw the birth of his fourth child in 1143, a girl called Mafalda, and the following year, 1154, on the 11th of November, the birth of his fifth child called Martin, as he was born on St. Martin's Day. It wasn't all roses for the royal family, and in June 1155, when he was just 8 years old, his heir, Henry, tragically died. Following this tragedy, the heir apparent became Martin. But let's see, Martin wasn't a king's name on the Iberian Peninsula, and certainly not in his grandfather's homeland. In the case of his late brother, Henry was the name given in honor of Afonso Henriques' father. But now, for the new heir, Martin, a name more suited to a king should be chosen, so Afonso Henriques opted to choose a purely Iberian name, Sancho. The following year, in 1156, his sixth son, John, was born, and the year after that, on the 24th of November, 1157, his seventh and last daughter, Sancha, was born. This brings us to the year 1157, when on the 21st of August, the Christian world lost one of its greatest representatives in the Iberian Reconquista. Alfonso VII, Afonso Henriques' cousin and the Emperor of Hispania, dies. He died on his return from a failed expedition to Almeria. The place of his death is uncertain, but it is likely to have been in the Sierra Morena area. With his death, and as written in his will, the Kingdom of Leon would be left to his now 20-year-old son, Ferdinand II of Leon, and the Kingdom of Castile to his other son, the 24-year-old Sancho III. The brothers agreed in the Treaty of Sahagún on the 23rd of May 1158 to define areas of conquest for each in order to continue the reconquest of European territory. But there was another small thing to deal with. What about Portugal? What were these two going to do with Portugal and King Afonso Henriques? Well, Portugal would have to be divided between the two in order to prevent Afonso Henriques from taking more territory to the south, leaving that to the now Ferdinand II of Leon. This topic was also discussed during the ceremony of this treaty. However, on the 31st of August 1158, Sancho III of Castile died unexpectedly, leaving the throne to his son, now Alfonso VIII of Castile, who was only 3 years old. This led Ferdinand II of Leon to greedily break the Treaty of Sahagún, that he had signed with his now deceased brother Sancho III. Meanwhile, and parallel to these events, a great misfortune occurred on the 4th of December 1157. Matilda of Savoy, wife of King Afonso Henriques, dies at the age of 32. So, at this point in time, there were 5 Christian kingdoms on the peninsula. Portugal to the west, the imperial throne of Leon, which was the worst-placed kingdom, geographically speaking, when compared to all the other ones, the Kingdom of Castile, which was now in the hands of a 3-year-old child, the Kingdom of Aragon to the east that already had taken over all the main Catalan counties, and the Kingdom of Navarre, which had no possibility of expanding southwards. Having said that, it wouldn't take long before Afonso Henriques realized this and started to take advantage of the series of events that had taken place in the last few years. He aimed to cut off Leon's ambitions for expansion to the south, but to do so, he would have to conquer Badajoz, the ultimate race to conquer the south of the Iberian Peninsula. But there was still the uncomfortable truth that he was not yet recognized by the papal authority as a de facto king, and this also left him in a vulnerable position in the event of a war against his cousins in Leon and Castile. Ferdinand II of Leon was by now busy with revolts in Galicia, but he was also masterminding the reunification of his father's kingdom, especially now that the Kingdom of Castile was being ruled by a very young 3-year-old leader. So, given this situation, King Afonso Henriques decides to attack the Kingdom of Leon, more specifically, the counties of Toronho and Limia. The reason for this attack is unclear. Perhaps Afonso Henriques was aware of this plan to reunite the two kingdoms, and that afterwards Ferdinand II would probably turn to Portugal. During these more or less troubled times, King Afonso Henriques received a proposal from Ramon of Berenguer, Count of Barcelona, married to Queen Petronila of Aragon, to marry his daughter Mafalda to the future heir to the throne of Aragon, Alfonso II. This proposal demonstrates two things. Firstly, a political rapprochement between Portugal and Aragon, in order to dissuade the power of Castile and Leon. And secondly, it proves the status that King Afonso Henriques had achieved, since he had to previously actively seek a bride for himself and even marry a daughter of a count of the Holy Roman Empire. Whereas now, the proposals came to him, even more so, from direct descendants and heirs of kingdoms. We've reached 1158, and the Muslim faction in the Iberian Peninsula is in total chaos. In Alcácer do Sal, there was an almost impenetrable citadel, and its safety was tied to a large and powerful fleet. However, the governor of Alcácer do Sal would suffer the same fate as Ibn Qazi. He was killed by the population for having sought an understanding with Afonso Henriques. This area was dangerously close to Lisbon, and posed a constant threat not only to that city, but also to the whole of the Extremadura province, and would therefore have to be neutralized. Although there are no records of the conquest, it is known that King Afonso Henriques led 2 separate offensives in that square, both assisted by crusaders passing along the Portuguese coast. On one of these occasions, Afonso Henriques led a siege where he defeated a much larger Muslim force. It is also known that Alcácer do Sal already belonged to the Portuguese in 1160, and as was the king's custom, during the following years various steps were taken to organize the territory and also to deal with the border with Leon, thus leaving the expeditions to the south to adventurers, such as the famous Gerald the Fearless. Relations with Ferdinand II of Leon were very unstable, with advances and retreats, truces and wars in Galicia, and due to the constant Portuguese presence there and their military superiority in the region, particularly on the northern border between the two kingdoms, they finally convinced Ferdinand II to give up on conquering Portugal, even marrying him to Afonso Henriques' 17-year-old daughter, Urraca. In 1162, Mafalda, Afonso Henriques' fourth daughter died, and so her betrothal with Alfonso II of Aragon was annulled. Also, in the same year, between the 30th of November and the 1st of December, Fernão Gonçalves, the king's man and supposed son of a noble from Afonso Henriques' court, took some night violence with him and attacked Beja, depopulating and looting it. At the time, most border economies involved looting settlements on the other side of the border, usually undertaken by raids, but it was also a form of social promotion. A year later, in August of 1163, Afonso Henriques' sixth son, John, died, aged just 8. Going back to the conquests, Gerald the Fearless was an adventurer who would become iconic and decisive. He and his band of armed men, who initially settled in Santarém, marched to the city of Trujillo and conquered it on the 15th of April 1165. In the same year, and in the beginning of autumn, they conquered the city of Évora, which they then sold to King Afonso Henriques. In December of the same year, they also conquered the square of Cáceres, and already in February of 1166, they conquered Montaches. In March, they took Serpa, and finally, in 1167, they conquered Jurumanha. Sources suggest that after these successive campaigns, Gerald was promoted to alcalde, who was a governor of a city, by Afonso Henriques. During this time, Ferdinand II didn't sit still and conquered the important city of Alcántara, which had the only operational Roman bridge in the middle course of the Tagus River. Alcántara in Arabic means the bridge. Meanwhile, Afonso Henriques was leading expeditions that conquered Moura and Alconchel, and he also built a castle in Coruche to add to Évора's defense system, as was the aim when he donated territories in the Tagus Basin to the Order of the Knights Templar. All these conquests managed to surround Badajoz to a certain extent, and the possible taking of the city was imperative to block the expansion of Ferdinand II of Leon to the south, and it would also give King Afonso Henriques enormous prestige to have a city of that size. But in 1168, Ferdinand II is said to have proposed an alliance to the Almohads of that city to help defend it in case the Portuguese tried to take it. The smaller cities like Trujillo and Montaches, taken by the Portuguese, would have been easily reversed, but Badajoz was not only much larger, it was also strategically much more important. Besides, if he let the Portuguese take it, then he could lose it for good, as it would be much harder to justify that conquest against the Portuguese than the Muslims. We are now on the 3rd of May, 1169. After the conditions have been met for an attack on Badajoz, Gerald the Fearless and his men advance, enter Badajoz, and manage to surround the citadel. Afonso Henriques, who was about 60 years old at the time and was nearby, learned of what had happened and galloped towards the city to reinforce the attack. But Ferdinand II also advanced to defend it, as did the son of the Almohad Caliph of that city, motivated by the proclamation of jihad against the Portuguese. The Almohads of Badajoz, knowing of the arrival of the Leonese troops, managed to break through the Portuguese siege and open the gates of the wall, thus allowing the troops of Ferdinand II to enter. The Portuguese were now at much greater risk, with the front and rear end of the army exposed, and having no other option, they began to retreat. And it was in this instance that the so-called misfortune of King Afonso Henriques occurred. Riding hastily out of the city, he hit his right leg on the bolt of one of the gates in the wall, breaking it. He was promptly picked up by his men and managed to ride as far as Caia, near Elvas, which was an area controlled by the Portuguese. But the Leonese forces managed to capture him and took him prisoner to King Ferdinand II. Afonso Henriques was made prisoner of Ferdinand II for 2 months. He was assisted in the treatment of his wounds by Leonese doctors and treated with cordiality. The conditions of his ransom were as follows. the release of all the squares that the Portuguese controlled to the east of Badajoz and north of the Minho province, as well as the promise that Afonso Henriques would not make any further advances on Badajoz. Despite the sad outcome, Gerald the Fearless was not satisfied with the way things turned out, and still tried to organize some attacks on Badajoz, but none of them were successful. This was the first stalemate in the Portuguese Reconquista. Afonso Henriques, after being freed, spent his time in the springs of São Pedro do Sul until November of 1169, recovering from his injuries, and when he was able to return to Coimbra, one of his first decisions regarding the Alentejo region was to grant a third of all the land that the Order of the Templars conquered south of the Tagus to them. It was there that they built several castles as a line of military defense, such as Ceras and Tomar. Afonso Henriques understood the need for such action, given that it would be difficult to build an effective defense line exclusively due to his power and resources, the extent of the territory, and the open conditions of the terrain. We now come to the end of episode 4, an episode that began with yet another triumph for King Afonso Henriques when he conquered Lisbon, as well as the birth of his heir Sancho, but ended with very bad news for him after the tragedy of Badajoz. In our next episode, we will see that the Epic of Badajoz isn't over yet, and that the clashes between the Portuguese and the Muslims are still going to be the talk of the town. And meanwhile, Afonso Henriques receives yet another bull from Rome. But what does it say? We'll see you in the next episode. Take care, kings and queens.